Hello and welcome to I think it's going to be episode 107. That's to be announced, but it's an absolute pleasure and honor today to be joined by Dr. Benjamin Gilmer. Who is he? He's a family physician and associate professor at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine and Mountain Area Health Education Center. That's a mouthful. Otherwise known as MAHEC, the Family Medicine Residency Program. He's an international Albert Schweitzer Fellow and attended Davidson College, followed by medical studies at the Sorbonne in Paris, France, and East Carolina University. Sorbonne, right? As the medical director for MAHEC or MAHEC's Rural Health Initiative and Rural Fellowship, he is passionate about advocating for global and rural health disparities. He's worked extensively in Central and South America and West Africa. Benjamin is committed to advancing medical education, point-of-care ultrasound, interprofessional collaboration, and inspiring students to pursue rural health. His advocacy work currently focuses on bringing media attention to the social injustice of mass incarceration. His book, which will be the main focus of our discussion today, The Other Dr. Gilmer, is from Ballantine Penguin Random House, and his feature film project through Concordia Films, both highlight the injustice of mass incarceration of people with mental illness. When you hear this episode, the book will be out. The book is out as of March 1st. Exciting stuff. Both of Doctor's projects are based on a 2013 This American Life podcast called Dr. Gilmer and Mr. Hyde, a collaboration between Benjamin and Sarah Koenig, of course, from Serial, which had more than 10 million listeners. You heard correctly, 10 million. A former neurobiologist turned rural family doctor, Dr. Gilmer has lectured across the country about medical ethics, global and rural health, bias in medicine, the intersection of medicine and social justice. He lives with his wife, Deidre, two children, Kai and Luya, and their dog, Prince Peanut Butter, in Asheville, North Carolina. Doctor, what a pleasure and an honor to talk to you. How are you today?
Good. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate you having me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Please make any corrections that besides maybe the mispronunciation of the famous Sorbonne. Anything
Sorbonne.
good? Okay, right. Anything else that you want to add or that I did not get correct?
No, that was all good.
All right. We talked a little bit before we started recording about your background and the inspiration from your father. You talk about having your parents, did divorce, but it sounds like you had an incredible amount of support from all sides. Just kind of wondering about growing up and, inspiration for being a doctor and just like an intellectual curiosity, which definitely comes through in the book.
Gosh, I think that came from both my parents, but my mother was a teacher. And so she had a deep curiosity for life and everything that's contagious. My father, who's an Episcopal priest / Jungian psychotherapist / pastoral care person, introduced me to the hospital and also introduced me to the humanistic side of medicine.
Okay.
And the spiritual side of medicine too. So they played a really big role in not only like being interested in medicine, but just being curious about the world and being committed to advocacy, which was always a part of their lives.
Right. I mean, it sounds like, definitely towards the end of the book and towards the end of the journey, not that the journey's over, but, you write a lot about the advocacy, and it sounds like that was always with you, that you always have been an advocate and it comes through, but it sounds like that's been, kind of sharpened through all you've gone through. I wonder maybe what kind of reading you were into as a kid. I mean, were you reading like, I don't know, medical journals that you find in the back of a library? Were you like a, fantasy comic book kid? Like what kind of, how was your intellectual curiosity satiated in those days?
I grew up in the country of Western Tennessee.
Okay.
I did more basketball playing than reading.
Nice.
So I was not a big reader. I read every Hardy Boys book,
of course,
in the Chronicles of Narnia, of course, and those kind of things. But reading became something that really grabbed me a little bit later in life. And reading was always a little bit more challenging for me, as I described in the book, that I later discovered that I have ADHD.
Right.
And so I never understood why reading was so hard growing up, that it took extra effort.
Sure.
So it was helpful later in life to to develop some more tools in my frontal cortex, to
Mhm.
enable me to understand how I could become a better reader, which
Right,
has been
right.
such a pleasure later in life.
I bet, I bet. The basketball thing, I didn't know about that. Okay, are you a fan of Tennessee basketball, or or is that like a thing of the past? Where do your loyalties lie, I guess?
Well, I've been in North Carolina since like full on since I was 18.
The cradle of basketball, right?
Yeah, so I'm on faculty at UNC, so I'm a Tar Heel fan.
Nice, nice.
Yeah.
Been a tough year, huh?
It's been a little rough.
Okay, well, that's gonna happen. They've had so much success. Go Tar Heels, yeah, with some greats, man. Speaking of the greats, you write a lot. You write so much about Dr. Albert Schweitzer, and I was did a little research. I mean, I've known about him, but I wondered kind of his impact on you from a young age to, well, you're still young, but from a young age to a not quite as young age. How he really inspired you, and then I guess that kind of transitions to your time in, help me, is it Gabon? Is that how you pronounce it?
That's right. Yeah, Schweitzer was someone that I didn't know about as a child or even as a young adult. Like
Uh-huh.
his story I discovered when I was in medical school. His story is somewhat similar to Dr. Paul Farmer too, who,
Okay.
to recognize his incredible life and
Oh man. Yes.
giving. So he died this past week, which
Hmm.
was a big tragedy. Dr. Farmer was inspired by Dr. Schweitzer.
Okay.
Schweitzer, who was someone who was more than a doctor, he was a philosopher and a theologian,
Right.
back at the turn of the century, really, and decided that he was going to devote his life to charity, but didn't know how he was going to do it. Ultimately, he became a doctor and moved to Africa and committed his life to service in Africa until he died. He
Hmm.
got the Nobel Peace Prize
Right.
before he died for speaking out against nuclear proliferation. So he was a great example to me of someone who he didn't just do medicine, he did everything.
Yes.
And
Yes.
he made such an impact coming from the jungle,
Hmm.
getting the Nobel Peace Prize. And so he was always an example, as I was a Schweitzer Fellow, so I was indoctrinated into his story and
Hmm.
always inspired by his work and the fact that he saw so much more than the medicine. Like he saw service as
Sure.
his calling, and really so beautifully intertwined service with medicine,
Hmm.
which we don't always learn in medical school. So
Yeah.
the book in part is sort of an homage to his work.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
Well, no pun intended, right? Indoctrinated, and that maybe that sometimes has a negative connotation, but clearly a positive here, where so much to learn from. I literally, as we speak, I have one of the tabs open. I'm meaning to read the New Yorker article from probably 20 years ago about Dr. Farmer.
Oh
Um,
yeah, that was a great one.
yeah, what an incredible loss, for sure. I mean, so I mean, the little I know of medical is obviously me as a patient, and you write about in the book a lot of the corporatization of the medical profession. My friend and I always joke, it's like you spend 45 minutes waiting and then you get 10 minutes with the doctor, or you're like, oh, can I ask you a question, as if you feel guilty. It's like, wait, that's what I'm here for. I'm here to ask him questions, and that's not ragging on my doctors. It's just, it's oftentimes just kind of like in and out and corporate. And you clearly do not serve that way when you work, at the clinic in North Carolina, of course, where you and the other Dr. Gilmer, Dr. Vince Gilmer, worked. You talk about how it's about the whole person and knowing their history and knowing everything about that. In the book, there's the great story, and it's towards the end, but it's about your time in Gabon, and you can tell it better than I can. But it's basically where a woman who you could tell had a lot of juice in the village, right? You could tell she was really respected and loved, and she literally like gave you the throne, right?
Well, for just a moment, she did. Her throne was
Okay.
a simple chair.
Uh-huh.
But first, like back to your experience as a patient, I'm so sorry that that's your experience. And this is the product of for-profit medicine in our country.
Mm-hmm.
This is the product of like mass corporatization of medicine, which is the disease that's spreading throughout our country.
Sure.
And so that things will only get worse until we have more of a service-oriented or public system.
Mm.
So I'm sorry that you only get 10 minutes. Like it's the abomination of what medicine should be. In Gabon, when I first experienced their style of medicine, it was so radically different because it was ultimately it was a public system, and it was a system where people felt like they had rights in the system.
Sure.
Where the physicians were more concerned about taking care of the whole community and what that means,
right,
rather than charging for every nickel and dime when you come into your doctor. Like it's not a system that's set up well for healing or for a patient-physician relationship.
Right.
In the book, I tried to describe a little bit about that, and the corporatization of medicine in America results now in many rural communities throughout the country not having hospitals, not having the ability to deliver babies, in their communities not having access to psychiatry, not having access to primary care medicine. And so it's such an endemic problem that I wanted to speak to a little bit in the book, which I did. Gabon receiving the throne for the day was a symbolic message from her that we all need to stand up.
Sure.
And I feel like there are rare opportunities in medicine for students. It may be just for people and teachers, for all people, like to have the moment where someone tells you, okay, this is your time. This is your time to step up, to be a leader. This is your time to have a voice. And there's a positive of those experiences in most people's lives, I think. So that moment in the book was important to me because she called me out.
Right. Yeah. I mean, to continue the metaphor, you really, the mixed metaphor, you really took that baton and you've run with it very successfully, for sure. But that was such a image, an image of her, like giving you the throne that was like, wow, really. And obviously so symbolic. And yeah, I don't want to plead, the fact that I've had very good medical experiences for the most part. Like you talk about the rural difference, right? I mean, I've been lucky to have, speaking of basketball, I was playing basketball in 2011 and ruptured the Achilles. Right. And I just think about like in a later time or in a different place or a different time, I might not have walked ever again or normally, you know what I mean? And those type of things, and great care for when we had our 2 children and all that. So I definitely understand how lucky I am, privileged of living in a city or suburban area and having access to those things that you talk about. A lot of people don't. Help me with the.
It's great if you have insurance,
right? Right. That's
there are millions.
The elephant in the room
who don't have the same access that we do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The elephant in the room, for sure. Help me with the pronunciation. Is it Broughton or Broughton? The
Broughton Hospital.
Okay, right. And so which ended up being the place where Dr. Vince Gilmer's dad was. Now that was one of your early places where you worked, right?
Yes. So my baptism in medicine as a first clinical rotation was the mental hospital.
Right.
I was hoping it would be in the emergency room where I'd sort of grown up, but I get put in the mental hospital instead. And it was such an informative experience that obviously has helped to define the arc of my life, my professional life, to an extent. It certainly, really inspired like parts of this book, being sort of keen or sensitized to the plight of mental health and how we have so few resources in our country. But yeah, I was so naive when I went to medical school. Like I didn't know about mental health. I didn't understand like what mental disease was. I didn't understand that there are so few hospitals to take care of these people.
Right.
There are 10 times more mentally ill people in prison than in mental hospitals.
That's
such as
incredible.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. So that summer experience was a true baptism, like into medicine, and realizing how broken our system is to have such so few opportunities for these people who are arguably these are our most vulnerable citizens, and they receive they have the least access to care, right? Because there's so few psychiatrists and mental health providers. More psychotropic medications in this country are delivered by primary care physicians than psychiatrists because there's so few of them. unfortunately.
Well, I don't remember if it's this part in the book or not when you're talking about Brown, maybe not, but you talk later about, like, as a teacher, I'm aware of the ACE, the acronym ACE, right? For what, adverse childhood experiences. And you do the numbers, and you talk about another one in the medical field that you've done with Dr. Vince. I want to say like the baseline was like 20, something like that. Remind me please of the name of that test or testing.
It's a test that that's designed to risk stratify you for sociopathy.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And so, the reason I bring that up is you talk about some of the stories at Broughton, and just like the, incredible hurdles that people would have, and some of those, traumatic childhood experiences, plus mental illness, or how mental illness is exacerbated by the conditions and all that. And you can see why that would have been so informative for you. Sounds like it was personally for you too, right? It sounds like your wife would come down to do yoga with the patients, and that was kind of like, you knew how great of a person she was, right? Something to that effect.
Well, she was just my girlfriend at the time.
Yeah.
And that was our first experience, like kind of living together, was at the hospital.
Yeah.
It was a real test of our relationship for sure.
Oh man. The epic This American Life episode, Ira Glass with his normal, I don't know if you call it monotone, but his great voice, his classic voice. He starts off by saying there were two things that you knew, some of that effect. One was that the former doctor had the same name as you, right, in this clinic in North Carolina, and that he'd killed his father. And that was like one of those, like, whoa, as soon as you're listening, you get it. So the full name of the book is the Other Dr. Gilmer, Two Men, a Murder, and an Unlikely Fight for Justice. With Ira Glass, introducing that. And in the book, you get into your early days in the clinic, and you talk about how you're seen as an outsider. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. And you got the job despite the fact that there were, you were sitting around the table kind of thing, right? And some of the people who made the decision were like, I don't know. And you're wondering what the deal was. And it was basically just because of your name, right?
Well, they were concerned that there would be another Dr. Gilmer there, and the murder had just ravaged the community.
Mm-hmm.
And this was only 4 or 5 years before I started. And so it was very much still on the mind of the community. And so it wasn't the best PR opportunity to send in another Dr. Gilmer to a clinic that was like just trying to rebirth itself.
Yeah.
And so everyone was concerned about that, except for me, because I wanted that job. It was the only one like that available. And so I didn't care.
Sure.
Nor did I really know anything about like the other Dr. Gilmer. I'd heard something had happened, but I didn't know any details really. I just wanted the job. And so I convinced them to give it to me.
Well, apparently Gilmer is a Scottish name. Is that correct?
Gilmer comes from Gilmore, which is the son of Morrison, which comes from the Hebridean Islands, the Isle of Skye.
Okay. You had to have done some informal or formal research over the years, right? I mean, to be in the same small town, not that you're from there, but same general part of the country. I mean, is there a link way back in the day, or is that not something you could figure out?
I mean, I didn't do the genealogy, but I mean, Gilmer is not a very common name in the South.
Right.
And that our ancestors came to South Carolina originally.
Okay.
Vince grew up in Alabama, so I'm sure at some point down the, one of our ancestors we shared in common.
Sure. Well, it's clear from the very beginning that you had great intentions and great, expertise and did a great job with the clinic. You tell an incredible, pretty telling story with the Mule Man, right? And he seemed to be like a, kind of grizzled veteran of the area, and he was not letting you off the hook. And you made some comment about riding mules, right? Because he still had mules. And how would you describe his response to that?
Mule Man his name was Bill. Who died a couple of years ago. He is such a great example of like this last American generation of people, like true farmers and people who have a suspicion, who are skeptical about medicine and the whole modern medical world. And I was an outsider in the community. Like I grew up in the country. Like I know how to speak country, but he was still a little skeptical of the big city, like perceiving me as like the big city guy coming into this clinic to take care of his health. So it takes a little time to develop a relationship with patients, to develop trust. Sometimes it takes years or decades to develop trust.
Sure.
And with Mule Man, it took some time, but he knew from the beginning that I wasn't from around these parts. I didn't know nothing about riding mules. So he put me in my place. Patients are always teaching us how to be humble. And Mule Man did that for me.
Sorry, backing up a little bit, tell us a little bit about Fletcher, North Carolina. Is that right? That's where the clinic is located?
Fletcher's outside of Asheville.
Okay.
About 25 miles outside of Asheville. Sits in a beautiful valley. It's kind of like the intersection or the warning track of the kind of the suburban sprawl that's starting in Asheville and the border of the Appalachian Mountains.
Okay.
So like the true Appalachia, our clinic, and in front of us, 20 miles in front of us, is the progressive urban development of Asheville. So it's a really interesting place where we, the spectrum of our patients are enormous. We have country, we have some city, we have ultra poor, we have the ultra wealthy, we have Latinos, and we have, people who've been living in the hollers for their whole lives, for generations. So it's a beautiful mix of people.
Wow. And you talk about, maybe some political differences. Obamacare didn't seem to be too popular with many of the people, but you talk about there's a sense of respect, a sense of shared respect, and maybe didn't necessarily always discuss politics if you didn't have to, but it was the idea of rural medical care and respect and really getting to know the families and the communities. And you kept hearing stories about Dr. Vince Gilmer, right? And the incredible care that he provided, the generosity, the selflessness. You end one of the first chapters, maybe the first chapter, with that story of the mice. And you talk about how, quote, you had to know more about him. And that, starts such a butterfly effect with the whole book. I wonder if you could maybe tell us about the story with the mice.
Sure. Our clinic sits upon a field, so that we have lots of rodents out there. And it was a story that just reminded me, as many of almost all the stories of the other Dr. Gilmer reminded me, that he was a person and really, really endeared by the community. And so it was hard for me when I started understanding or hearing stories about him, these beloved stories, in contrast to the story that I knew, that I'd read about, that he murdered his father and chopped off his fingers and left him on the side of a road. It just didn't make sense. Like there was this dissonance between all these stories. And so when I learned that, he would never kill the mice, the rodents in the clinic, he would capture them and release them to the field. Like sociopaths don't do that. Sure. Oppositionally defiant people or children don't do that. Like that. That's a real demonstration of reverence that he had, which did not jive with a cold-blooded murderer, which is what the judge branded him as, or as a manipulator, or as a malingerer, a faker of his symptoms. Like these were all the things that he had been labeled as. And when you see the mouse in the palm of his hand, like you realize like that something just does not add up. Right. Nor did all the other beautiful stories that people told about him. So that, it was those stories, the power of the story that is so much more powerful than a direct argument, right? And so those stories really inspired me to look further, like to open my eyes a little bit more.
Sure.
And to try to understand who he was as a person, to look beyond, the preconception that he was just a murderer. It's something we try to do as doctors every day. We try to erase our biases and preconceptions when we walk into a room. And that's what I really intentionally tried to do for him.
Well, you write about one of the patients who comes in, and I wonder, maybe, I don't know if you, the psychology of it, was this kind of like testing the new guy a little bit too, but he comes in and he basically tells you like, hey, the other Dr. Gilmer knows about you. It's kind of like he considers you a usurper, right? And like he can't be happy about it, right? And obviously it shook you to the core. And you talked about how in the moment you went, white as a ghost, and in the months and maybe even years to come, you were like, paranoid is not the word, because it seemed like you had legitimate, fear. But I just wonder,
No, no,
maybe.
I was paranoid.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Right.
I was paranoid and fearful, like after that moment. I've been sort of naive until he told me that the other Dr. Gilmer was probably going to come after me when he gets out.
Uh-huh. And
So
of
that
course, he
was
had a life sentence, right?
well, I didn't exactly know what his sentence
Uh,
was. I life, but people get out of prison
sure.
for a variety of different reasons, but coming directly from him, like this, it was very provocative, and for the first time made me reflect on, well, gosh, I really am in the path of this guy. And it's easy for your mind to spin out of control when you start thinking about him as a sort of potential monster, or
Right.
yeah. I mean, it was paranoia.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I can only imagine. I mean, you describe it very well, but yeah, I can only imagine that. Just the idea of like you're the other Dr. Gilmer, or he's the other Dr. Gilmer, both.
I took his life. I
Right.
resumed
Right.
the life that he had worked so hard for.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, it was just seemed natural that I could be a target. I mean, it was kind of ridiculous paranoia at the time. Like now that knowing all the things I know about him, and
Mm-hmm.
like I realized it was kind of dramatic, but it was an experience I really felt. My family was telling me I should probably leave the clinic and maybe even leave Asheville, and stuff like that.
Right.
So it was it felt very real at the time.
Oh, I bet. Yeah, you wrote about the quote existential anxiety, and I know the life of just a professional in general, and then you're fairly new, and then there's his story, and life gets in the way, and with all its greatness, but all its, the tough things too. So you talked about tense life, and I assume that's having trouble turning it off when you leave work, right?
Well, you know what it's like having young children.
Mm-hmm.
And my kids were like, my daughter had just been born. My son was 2. I had only had a few months of being a doctor under my belt. Like I was trying to figure that out. It was a confusing time, trying to define myself as a physician, trying to define myself as someone, in relation to the other Dr. Gilmer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, life can be a struggle.
Yes.
Working 75 hours a week during those days
Oh
was
my gosh.
trying to be a dad and a doctor, and trying to be responsible for my patients and my wife, and maintaining that relationship. Like it was a hard time.
I can only imagine. You run into Tommy at the farmer's market, and he, you get to find out, like, crazy, what a small world, that he formerly worked for the clinic, and obviously knew Dr. Vince very well. And he tells stories of his generosity, that he sells what, like jelly and preserves and that kind of thing, and
Yeah.
Dr. Vince was his seed money, right? And those kind of things.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, because Vince was so gracious towards people, and he would give away care. He gave Tommy money to start his business, like that, even when he didn't have it.
Right.
And part of his like sort of mantra of gratitude was, well, it was coming from the fact that he came from nothing himself. Like he wasn't rich at all, middle class or less, and had been abused by his father his whole life. So he had immense gratitude just for making it to where he was. And he also had this evolving disease. I don't know if, I don't want to give away too much about the book, but he had this evolving disease that also contributed to his personality and his like effusive generosity.
Right.
He was kind of like too much. Like he would give his friends presents all the time. Like just, if he felt like doing something, he would just do it. Kind of the way we should all be. But he was doing it because he had an evolving, neurologic disorder that was affecting his brain.
Right.
And that made him, it kind of stripped away his filter of, of being distant from people. He was very close to people, and his patients loved that. Like they absolutely adored the fact that he erased like the barriers of proximity and allowed them to be close to him, and that extended to everyone that was with him. So it's a kind of a beautiful example of making us realize all the barriers we put in front of ourselves with our friends, our families, our patients. Like it's a lot of barriers that we artificially put in front of us, between us, and Vince didn't do that.
No doubt about it.
Woody Guthrie do that, who also shared the same disease. And so much of Woody Guthrie's genius came from the fact that he was released, like he was free in a way, because he was uninhibited because of his brain, and that allowed him to be so pure with his voice and his music.
Wow. First of all, the Woody Guthrie story was amazing. That you'd met his granddaughter.
His granddaughter is Sarah Lee Guthrie, Arlo Guthrie's daughter.
Right. And yeah, I mean, I know generally about Woody Guthrie and his great, legacy, but the fact that they shared this disease, talking about him and Dr. Vince, and I hadn't thought about it so much about the impulsivity and the lack of barriers.
Yeah.
Are the things that made them great. Yeah. And they were also like, symptoms of, the impulsivity. And you write about how Doctor had, there was a before and after, right? There was, which, some of it. So we later find out that he'd been in a car accident that, who knows how much of a part that played, but he basically divorced his wife kind of out of nowhere. I mean, you can never say out of nowhere.
Precipitously.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And, started drinking and hanging out more at the bar and doing these impulsive things. And yeah, giving away money sounds great, but it's also like he was in big time debt. It's just amazing. That's really kind of just coming to me now, that connection between him and Woody Guthrie and all that. Wow. Wow. You had flashbacks at this point in the book. You wrote about, to Broughton, and you start to read up on the details of the case, and it's brutal. I mean, he strangled his father, right? He, like you said, he cut off his fingers for lack of evidence. He dumped him, and he also made all kinds of decisions that, if it seemed like there was premeditation in those things that he did, there were also things he did that were just, this made no sense, right? What do you think? How would you describe that time? Was it a week? It was at least a few days where he just went back to work and things were just normal after the murder. Is that just a disassociative? Is that shock? How would you describe that?
Yeah, it's really interesting what can happen. The brain is a character in this book. I don't know if you picked up on that the unraveling of the brain. And
yes,
my first career was a neuroscientist, and so I'm deeply intrigued by the workings of the brain and how trauma affects the brain. That was part of my master's thesis.
Okay.
And for Vince, he was delusional at the time.
Okay.
Killed his father. But it was a trilogy of things that were like conspiring against him. Our brains are under threat all the time. Right now, our brains are under threat in many ways, whether it be stress, whether it be illness, whether it be the toxicity of our contemporary life.
Yeah.
In many ways. But Vince's brain was under threat because he had this evolving neurologic disease. He had a traumatic brain injury just a few months before. He had come off his antidepressant medication precipitously. All three of those things can make you delusional, which he was. But the missing piece was that he had been abused by his father his whole life, like graphic, like abuse. That was what he knew from his father was abuse. I mean, he knew love as well, but he was like, physically tortured, and sexually abused by his father. And so, in that moment when he was retrieving his father from the facility to bring him home, his father tried to abuse him again. And that was what his brain couldn't take it. His brain was already spiraling out of control.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the last thing that separated his ability to control his mind from loss of control. And that's sort of, I describe as a cognitive fallibility.
Okay.
But we all, I mean, the human brain it's universal that we share this cognitive fallibility, and we all have our threshold for tripping into the darkness. And that was when Vince tripped into the darkness. But I really tried to make the point that this is a human experience.
Yes.
Not to kill your father, but it's a human experience for your brain to, move beyond its resiliency zone.
Mm-hmm.
And if we pay attention to that, we recognize that, oh gosh, this is such a truth. I described a moment in the book where I was way out of my resiliency zone and was threatened to shake my crying baby, in a terrible moment of darkness, which I didn't do, thank God, but I could have,
Yeah.
And the whole point of this is really to sensitize us to this notion that we all share this in common,
Mm-hmm.
and that mental health is a part of all of our existence. It's not just it's not a crazy, pathology or disease. It's a common pathology
Mm-hmm.
and disease that we all share from time to time. Just like people have heart attacks, strokes, or you pulled your Achilles tendon, it's a very discrete disease. And mental illness is a very discrete disease.
Mm-hmm.
It affects the most complicated organ in our body, the brain. How could it not screw up from time to time? And that's what happened with Vince Gilmer that night.
Well, that's some of the greatness of this book and the story is that there's an empathy there. It's not when you obviously you're so qualified with the science behind it, and it's like we can kind of know viscerally maybe that like the brain is sensitive and fragile. I mean, all the neurons firing and everything that's going on, right? Plus stress, plus all the things you talk about. But there is definitely a sense of empathy, like that could be me, but for the grace of God go I, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That is the point. That is the point, that it could be you. It could be me. And the fact that like my path with the same name was put right in front of his,
right,
was just another layer, another reminder that wow, that could have been me.
Yeah.
And for Vince, and for for the offspring of Woody Guthrie, like it's a coin toss.
Sure.
Like if your parent has this neurologic disease, like it's a coin toss whether or not you get it.
Mm-hmm.
And so he lost the coin toss, and I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
I won.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard not to be grateful for that.
Right.
And to identify with the fact that, yes, this could be you.
Yeah. And, sometimes you can like hear something like that, like, oh, but for the grace of God go I, I could be on the streets too, one paycheck to paycheck. And you kind of like take that in kind of a glib way, like, yeah, okay. But for me, it really, I feel like for the readers, it'll foster empathy, like, not like, oh yeah, man, that could be me. Oh shoot, it's like that is a lot of people, and if we're all connected, like you write about, then that's me, in that kind of way. When you talk about him being delusional, like one of the things you do so well in the book too is you talk about like preconceptions that doctors might have or do have, and you talk about like, like for example, he kept talking using non-medical terms, which he thought was interesting, right? Like my brain, it's like mush. That wasn't exactly what he said, but he'd
It's
say
not working right.
It's not working right, and serotonin and this, and but I guess what I'm getting at is delusion, like what is it, the PSM-4, like is delusion a medical term like that can be objectified, or is that still subjective?
Oh no, it's very objective.
Okay.
And there are different types of delusions:
Mm-hmm.
auditory delusions, visual delusions, hallucinations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, there's a spectrum, a mix of kind of delusions.
Right.
Right. But it's a medical diagnosis.
Okay. So you're writing about SSRI and serotonin and the quote balancing act, like we talked about. Some of the precedent that you read about, some other cases, in which unfortunately Dr. Vince was added to the list, right, of people who had claimed, I guess, psychosis or or in the law, in the legal sense, they not guilty by way of this whole precedent and the whole balancing act, like I said. And right about that time is when Sarah Koenig, am I saying her name right?
Sarah
Koenig and This American Life, came into your life and talked about wanting to do this story. And you said no at first, right?
I said no. Yeah. I said,
what made you say no? What made you say yes eventually?
Well, I said no because I didn't want my name to be on national radio.
Sure.
I didn't want him to know that I was there. Like, I was still a little bit paranoid in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
But then I realized that I couldn't put it off. Like, if I was to continue my life as the other Dr. Gilmer in that clinic, like, I just had to know. Like, I had to know what happened to him. Like, it was beginning to, I was getting obsessive about it. And so I was working so hard during those days, and still am. And so I reached back out to Sarah to ask her if she could help be a mentor and to help me do the work, like to figure this out, and to do it in a way that was like, we could like zero in together, and she could help me do interviews. We could parcel the work out to each other. I didn't realize it would take 6 months.
Right,
we would
right.
spend 6 months together, and now there have been like 15 million people who've listened to the podcast. So it was like a real experience it was a real learning curve for me, but I couldn't have done it without Sarah, like really jumping in and creating like a motor, to get this done.
Well, yeah, it sounds like you were good compliments to each other. She's obviously very well accomplished in her field and later did serial. And you said she's, kind of got the East Coast, like very like blunt kind of thing going on. And, you guys got things done together.
We did.
Right?
The serial actually came about through our story, because she learned of that case through a lawyer that we connected with regarding Vince.
Wow, really?
And at the end of our story, she, our story was supposed to be a 15-minute segment, and it became an hour. We both realized, oh, this could have been like a longer version serial story.
Yes.
But before serial came out.
Right. Some of the main interviews are with Terry. Is that Terry, right? And then Detective Martin, and Terry kind of was almost kind of like, he got in a car accident. Well, he had boards coming up, and maybe he didn't want to take them, and kind of half joking, but she mentioned the car accident as, happening kind of around the time that he really did the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. Detective Martin was very clear on that he felt that that Dr. Vince was playing it up, right? That he was an actor, that he was crazy like a fox. And so that contrast between the two was interesting. I wonder what you kind of learned from some of those interviews that you hadn't heard before. Or is that a list, like, is that a laundry list of a lot of things?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so many people that I interviewed for This American Life piece and for the book. And I guess the takeaway from that for me is that everybody is so grounded in their own preconceptions.
Yes.
Which is just, it's a natural part of the brain. Like, our brain is wired for preconception because it makes it easier for us. And it's really hard to change preconceptions. I mean, that's part of the problem with politics right now.
I was just going to say, look at the political.
Yeah, it's like, this is why our world is devolving right now, because we are so embedded in our own biases and preconceptions that it doesn't matter what kind of argument you have for it.
No,
it doesn't matter that Vince Gilmer had a genetic test that told the world with 100% certitude that he was not a malingerer. That he had a disease. And there were 4 good reasons for him to act that way. Doesn't matter. Like, Detective Martin will never believe that he's not a malingerer. Does believe that he can't solve the problem of crime by himself, and neither can I. Like, that it takes us to get out of our silos to do it. But yeah, that's why I think that the power of story and books resonate with people, because it allows them to form their own opinions. It allows them to be part of a story, and not to be the brunt of a targeted argument, which I did try to make in the last chapter.
Yes.
Was sort of my targeted argument, but I tried to do it as a story still, and to let the argument speak through Vince's story and my own story.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. So, I mean, a big hurdle that you had to overcome was, Sarah said, well, you need to, you should be writing to Dr. Vince, and she was following up, right? Like, you should, we want to visit him. And it took a while, but you did. And how would you describe how addled he was physically, mentally? He was using, some of the same terms again. It would have, serotonin brain. And at the end, Dr. Sarah said, is he crazy, or is he crazy like a fox? Something to that effect. You write about, just the animalistic nature, and how he talked about his mistreatment, but you'd be better describing it. How would you describe his mental and physical state?
It was shocking to see him for the first time. It was also shocking for me to be in a prison for the first time.
Sure.
As a privileged white boy, I had never seen that before. And so my nervous system was on high alert. But when he walked in, he looked like a character from, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Literally. And in that moment, it made me think, oh, I understand why Detective Martin thought he was malingering.
Sure.
Because he looked crazy, in non-psychiatric terms. Like he looked like someone who had been caged for years, like hunched over, grimacing, finger twitches, facial twitches, not walking steadily, difficulty finding words. Like, he looked like a disturbed human being. Is what he looked like, which is what a lot of people in prison look like. Okay. Because when you go to prison, if you're not mentally ill, when you go to prison, you become mentally ill. Like, it's inescapable to have your brain rewired to be predisposed to trauma, because it's such a traumatizing experience. But yeah, so in that moment, Sarah and I both thought, oh my gosh, like it was kind of frightening, because we didn't know. It was kind of confirming that there was something crazy about him.
Yeah.
But my clinical instinct told me that there was something clearly wrong with him, and that he couldn't be faking symptoms for 10 years.
Sure.
And that his symptoms were neurologic in nature, and that he clearly had depression, anxiety, etc. So, but it's funny, because like when we left that prison that day, it was like, I knew, like my prefrontal cortex knew that he was a sick man. But the amygdala and the part that's like really influenced by preconception and bias, my limbic system, which had been afraid of him for so long,
sure,
was still triggering this question of, like, is he a sociopathic person? Is he still dangerous? Is he still a threat to me? Is he still all of these things? And so, even though, like, this was my own battle with like preconception and bias, because I knew, like, intellectually, like, I knew that he should be a patient, not a prisoner, that he was sick, not a sociopath. And but I was still like fighting that battle. And so that's why I kind of snuck in a psychiatrist to the prison with me.
Yes.
To help be another, unbiased view of his behavior, and to tell me that he was not a sociopathic person, he was not a grand manipulator, that he had a neurologic, illness that I suspected he had.
Well, after the first visit, you dived into the reading about the court case, and I think you literally even like took time off work or took a little weekend or something, right? And just dove into it. And I mean, just farcical would not even begin to describe it, right? I mean, he eventually became his own, Dr. Vince became his own counsel.
He fired his lawyers. What should be an indication to anyone that you have mental troubles if you fire your lawyers for your own murder trial.
Yeah.
It was an abomination of what due process should look like. You didn't have any expert witnesses. He called himself to the stand as an expert witness. He fumbled through every defense. He was unable to formulate any meaningful, sentences that would were rational even.
Right.
And so to imagine someone watching that, and the lawyer that he fired, who sat behind him in court, described it as someone trying to commit suicide with a butter knife. That's how torturous it was to watch this trial. Yet, when he ultimately tried to call when he ultimately told the judge and the prosecutor very directly, my mind is not working right. I request to have a psychiatrist to reevaluate with me. I cannot go on. After he said those words, they swiftly convicted him. They denied him the opportunity. He did have the opportunity to present those expert witnesses, but he didn't do it because he was delusional and unstable throughout his own trial.
Right.
When he finally broke down in the end, they said no. The judge said no, and it only took 20 minutes to convict him.
Oh my
gosh. Although it was what would be considered a constitutional trial, it was not a moral trial.
Right.
In my mind, it symbolizes like so many things that are wrong with our whole system, our carceral system, our psychiatric system, that we could let this happen. While everybody in that court knew that there was something not right with him, yet no one was willing to take the extra step to do anything because everybody had their own bias. Everybody had their own goal. Prosecutor had her goal to convict him because she wanted to be the DA one day.
Sure.
The judge was ready to just be done with this crazy trial because this was a guy from North Carolina and Virginia, and he just wanted to be done with it. Like the jury wants to get home to their family. Like there's no interest in truth always in our system. It's not designed to always be truth finding. It's not that it's designed to perpetuate all of our biases all the time too, but that's just like human nature. Like it takes so much intentional effort to not be biased.
Right.
It takes so much effort for our democracy to continue because, democracy arguably is not a natural process either. It takes work, like, to make these things be functional.
Right. Well,
sorry to ramble on there.
No, not at all. Not at all. In the This American Life episode, there was I was listening in the car. I'm like, oh my gosh, Sarah talks about how Vince had called, I don't know, one of his friends or somebody he knew fairly well, maybe from childhood, and he said something to the effect of like, have you ever known me to do anything bad in my life? And the woman literally said, well, besides killing your father. It's like, oh my, just the idea of just backfiring questions, just painful to read about, to hear about. And you alluded to a little before, but incredibly painful to read about the sexual abuse that he suffered from his father, right? And his sister was also a victim of it, right?
His sister was also a victim, and who was also killed. His sister was murdered.
Yes. And it sounded like the traumas just continued for her and for the family. And I wonder,
well, this is the story of intergenerational abuse.
Right.
It just cycles through generations, and hasn't stopped yet in this poor family, unfortunately.
I wonder, and I'm just searching for the words. Like, do you about Dalton? He had this disease as well. Does that take away any culpability? Like I said, just horrific things, and it led to continued traumas for his kids.
Yeah.
Do we?
Well, I think it does take away some of his culpability. A lot of people will always argue that we are always responsible for ourselves. The conservative right will argue that, any of these behaviors or actions should be punished. And, the truth is that Dalton was a miserable soul. Like, he had been abused by his father. He had this neurologic disease too. And after Vietnam, which was a very stressful trigger, like it unleashed the disease to begin to blossom. And so, I feel sorry for Dalton. because he had he had an experience without any treatment as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he had trauma without treatment. And so, it doesn't excuse the fact that he abused his son his whole life, but it helps you to realize like the extent that his brain had become damaged,
Mm-hmm.
and what happens when a brain becomes damaged, and why we need support for, these people, these patients. So, if Dalton had been diagnosed with this mystery disease, then Vince would have known that he would have had it, and then the jury would have known that he had it, and he never would have set one foot in prison. If the diagnosis had been made during the trial, he never would have gone to prison. He would have gone to a treatment facility, a hospital, a place where he could get care. The same is true for Dalton. Dalton did get treatment. He did get care at Broughton Hospital, but that was after years of like being destitute on the street, being a drug addict, being just being a tortured person, not knowing why his brain was unraveling himself. I mean, that's in itself, that's a really hard thing, to have your brain unravel and not know why. And that was the experience of both Dalton and his son Vince.
I guess, I don't know. I mean, what do you want the reader to do, or suggest the reader to do, or what does the reader do with that anger towards the father? Because it's horrific, it's incredibly damaging, and that mix of feeling sorry for, is that just kind of like the thing, where you've really moved towards advocacy and information and changes in laws? I don't know if it's maybe a rhetorical question or not, but
I asked this question like throughout writing the book, like, what do we do with all this? Like, how do we change? And so the conclusion for me was not like the scripted plan for mental health reform. Like, there are a lot of people who are doing that.
Sure.
And I want to contribute to that messaging, but I think the bigger goal, like, is this, the notion of reverence for life that I left throughout the last chapters, that, in order for us to see who Dalton was, in order for us to see who Vince was, in order for us to see who we are, you have to move closer to this notion of reverence for life, which is the philosophy that Albert Schweitzer left for us. And that it's a very simple message, that we have to revere all things, all organisms, all people who are trying to survive, who are fighting for their survival. Dalton was fighting for his survival. We're all fighting for our survival, and we don't have the time or the ability often, like, to clear those biases and think about, like, oh wow, well, that guy he's fighting for his survival too. How can I be more open-minded to that? I mean, it's something we practice in medicine every day. Like, that's our goal, right? We're trying to help people who are fighting for survival. We're trying not to inject ourselves into it. We're trying to just look at them as a tabula rasa.
Right.
And in order for our democracy to work, like, this is what we have to do too. We have to have reverence for Democrats and Republicans. We have to have reverence for the scorned, for the abusers of the world. We have to figure out a way to find, like, if you find reverence, then it's almost like finding Zen. If you find reverence, then you can go beyond all of those preconceptions, and you can start to see why someone became this person.
Sure.
Why this person needs help, and why incarceration just does not work. Like, punishment just does not work. And there are 800,000 incarcerated people with severe mental illness. 800,000 currently.
Wow.
Like, it's nuts. Again, 10 times more people than are mental hospitals. So, like, if you can start to believe in reverence for life, if you can start to intentionally practice it, then you can start to see beyond the page and see who people are. And that's when healing begins.
Now, is that the 37%, like 30 that you cite, like 37% of those in the system have mental illness of some sort?
That's right.
Right. Those numbers are the numbers are staggering.
Staggering.
Help me with the pronunciation. Dr. Angliker?
Dr. Colin Angliker.
Yes. What an incredible shining light throughout the
Whew.
book. Right. You mentioned, okay, so you go with Dr. Steve, who psychiatrist. Am I correct about his
Correct.
credentials, right? And that's when you leave that day and he says, what about, and we'll leave a little bit of the plot, but the neurological disease that you mentioned. And that just opened up a whole world of, oh my gosh. And that is a disease that is objective. There is a test for that, right? It's not, well, preconceptions, or I think this, I think that. There's a test for that. And Dr. Collin just incredibly, been fighting for 40, 50 years for, humane conditions in prison and better mental health. And right around that same time too, fortunately your father, had a successful surgery and such, but you paint the contrast between him having this heart surgery that was obviously so nerve-wracking, and then Dr. Vince, and like, difference in care and all of that. When when This American Life wraps up, had the neurological diagnosis had been made, correct?
Yes.
Right. And you
Like
were
literally the week
Mhm.
that the podcast came out,
I thought so, right?
the test was confirmed.
Yeah, and and you were surprised that Vince was at peace with it in many ways, right? Um, and with that, NPR had to move on, and you were not stuck with it, but you were thinking to yourself, okay, I can't stop now, right? I have so much connection to him, and there's so many wrongs that I see. You really, this mission continued. Um, but I wonder what you would attribute Vince's peace to, especially upon learning about this diagnosis that is degenerative.
Wait, so what is your question? I'm sorry.
I wonder where do you think the peace came from with Dr. Vince when he found out, that he did have this illness that is degenerative. It's not, it's not a good sentence to get.
Well, it was a double-edged sword, right? Do you want to die in prison, or do you want to die from this disease, or do you want to do both?
Mm.
And so, it was a death sentence for him to get the
Mm-hmm.
diagnosis, but he'd already received that death sentence.
Sure.
Like the day he went to prison, he received a death sentence,
Mm-hmm.
not literally, but emotionally. But I think the thing that was so powerful for Vince was his whole life, he knew something was not right. He knew something was not right with his dad. He knew instinctively that he didn't want to have children because he thought something was not right with him, but he didn't know. And so imagine like living your whole life with yourself, knowing that something was not right, but not understanding why. Like that's such a burden to carry.
Mm.
And so for him, just finally knowing why, and being able to like communicate with people that he wasn't a cold-blooded killer, that he was sick, and this is why.
Mm-hmm.
That was such a relief for him.
Mm.
It was an enormous relief for him. And I want to just point to that neurologic illness that he had was not the reason why he killed his father. It's not a killer disease, but it is just one other underlying factor that tremendously like destabilized his brain in concert with all the other things happening to him.
Right.
Ultimately contributed to his demise. But for him, like he experienced an elation. Like he was elated that finally someone had taken interest in him. Finally, Dr. Angeliker, the first physician throughout his whole incarceration, was listening for him, was caring for him. And that was just so life affirming.
Mm-hmm.
Every life affirming experience he had been removed until that moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, it became the Gilmer family, truly, right? The Gilmer family expanded, and you made that Thanksgiving visit, which happened to be your son or daughter's birthday as well.
It's always my daughter's birthday.
Yeah.
She's born on Thanksgiving.
Right. And just, beautiful back and forth. He would do art and, letters as best he could, and they could, and really just became something where it was, really nothing else to say besides part of the family. And, so much of the rest of the book is about that, and about some incredible work. Bless you for the work you've done. And then getting in touch with like Innocence Projects and lawyers and people working, towards clemency. And as I read with the couple clemency appeals that were made, I'm like, okay, I got this one figured out. It's going to be positive or it's going to be negative. And, it's just incredibly like nerve wracking, as if going through it in real time, and like much of life, the book doesn't have an ending. Not everything is wrapped up neatly and nicely, but you do end with, like you just talked about a few minutes ago, like kind of pardon the pun, your prescription, and talking about just a different like paragon, a different way of looking at both the law, but especially the way that we treat the mentally ill. And then you wrote the book. I wonder what it's coming out in a couple of days. We're recording on the 27th of February. It's coming out on March 1st, and people will hear this on March 3rd or 4th. I wonder what you think the book can do, what the book will do, what the book has done, what feedback you've gotten from it about Dr. Vince's case and about your story.
Well, I have hopes for what it could do, but I mean, what I've seen, like the work, I think the book is a tool, and and the book is not about. Gosh, it feels so like self-glorifying to write a book that has you in it, and I feel shameless doing that. But I want the book to be a story that will tell like how all of us can become advocates. And this is sort of our niche in family medicine. Like we're not specialists, but we are advocates.
Sure.
And that's what hopefully patients want out of their doctors. So, I hope there will be a message that will speak to that, the importance of advocacy and the importance of people pursuing their own advocacy journeys. And I've seen that with my students, that it's been a powerful message that, if a rural country doctor can do this, why can't I? Why can't I jump in? And even if it's one person or one thing, it's like the power of one. Yeah. I've learned through this whole media process that the power of one can be exponentially, powerful.
Yes.
I never imagined we would have 15 million listeners to the podcast. I never imagined I would write a book. I would never imagine that a feature film is currently being made about the story. But I think it's because people inherently recognize when something's wrong and they want to do something about it. And so it's a call. It's a call for people to pursue that. It's a call for people to think differently about their brains, to normalize their brains, to think differently about mental illness, and to realize that ultimately the final message is that it's just wrong what we do. Like it's inhumane from a physician's eyes, from any human's eyes. It's just wrong to lock up our mentally ill forever.
Yes.
Like that's just immoral. Like it's an affront to the Hippocratic oath that I took. It's an affront to our humanity. And the fact that we still do it today, the fact that we still kill people today in our incarceral system is barbaric, to say the least.
Yes. Yes.
So, many people are speaking out against this. Brian Stevenson, the Marshall Project, the Innocence Project. There are many voices who are doing this. And I wanted to contribute to that collective voice and to reframe it through, a clinical lens that really is hopefully unbiased.
Right.
And that we don't treat patients this way. Why should we treat our prisoners this way? Like it's just wrong.
Well, you talk so well in the book, and here we've been talking just about preconceptions, and it does seem like they're being hardened more than ever if you talk about like politics and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
But I think that's the beauty of reading, right? The beauty of the great writing in this book, the stories, the personal, like getting to know people. I don't know how you read this book and don't come away changed. I don't know how you read this book and don't want to be an advocate in some way. I don't know how you read this book and don't just have everything changed. I mean, I know I'll be looking at reading the news differently from now on after having read this book. I'll be paying more attention to, motions in court. I'll be paying more attention to justice and innocence projects and those type of things. And I'll definitely be paying more attention to Dr. Vince's case. I wonder, what you might recommend for like places to give money, places for us to investigate, to do more research on, where to buy the book, those kind of things.
I mean, there are lots of, I want to tell people to get involved in their community first.
Okay.
You don't need to, you don't need to give money to the Equal Justice Initiative. I mean, they need money too. Like all these social justice missions need money, but I would tell people like to figure out what your mission, what your personal mission is. Regarding this story, if people want to reach out, like on my website, I'm gonna start listing like this weekend opportunities for learning, like learning about the Marshall Project, learning about Brian Stevenson's EJI, learning about what the Innocence Project does, learning about specific things, just so people can have a place to start. I mean, part of the message is that's hard for people, and was hard for me. It still is hard for me. Is, well, where do you start? Where do you start your sort of hero's journey? Sure. Like where do you start with advocacy? It's so daunting to think about all these things that are happening. How do you insert yourself? How can you contribute? Ultimately, everybody wants to contribute something. So that's the hard part, I think, is finding where you can intersect with advocacy messaging. Write to your local senator. Talk to your PTO group at school. Talk to your neighbors. Like that's where it starts. But I'm going to make a list of places where people could be a launching pad for this particular social justice mission of mass incarceration.
Much appreciated. I'll share, the website is Benjamin Gilmer, GILMER.com. Is that right?
That's right.
Right.
That's
and
right.
It's all is one word, obviously. And you can buy the book there. Any local bookstores or any bookstores you want to shout out, like in your area?
Yeah, Malaprops in Asheville, North Carolina is our home. Independent bookstore. They're very supportive of the written word and regional authors. They've been fantastic. Yeah.
Well, the word is going to be out and out and out with the book. And I wonder if we could maybe just end with you telling us a little bit about the movie in the works.
The movie in the works is a story that, first, I had the great opportunity to write this book sort of in parallel with the screenwriter, Jennifer Fox, who's a Sundance winning, Emmy nominated screenwriter director, who did The Tale, the movie The Tale that was on HBO. It was the Me Too movement of this generation film. And so we had the opportunity to become really good friends and to write in a parallel process. So she was a mentor to me, like during this process. We both informed each other, and she's the heart of social justice too. So it's being produced by Concordia Films, Maven Pictures, and Social Construct Films. Okay. Concordia is the conglomerate of Jonathan King and Laureen Powell Jobs widow of the Emerson Collective.
Yes.
So they have many Oscar-nominated films, and they're one of the biggest nonfiction film production companies in the country right now. So they're amazing. Okay. So it's going to be based on the book. For the most part, things change a lot, but I'm so excited about the film because it's going to be able to speak to a broader audience too about this, and hopefully Jennifer's writing is just so incredible, and the filmmakers, all of them are just brilliant. So I'm thrilled to have like this team on board. They've been so supportive. We're like we become a family throughout this whole book writing process. Great. Yeah,
that's great to hear.
Love them.
That's great to hear. Is who's playing you? No.
We don't have talent. We don't have talent identified yet.
Oh man. Well, like you said, it's gonna, with the book and the movie, and then of course, This American Life episode is still out there, and it's not, it's not the full story, but Mind Changers, Informers, all of those are just gonna get the word out, and up there with Brian Stevenson and Father Greg Boyle, who works out on the West Coast with gang intervention, and Dr. Albert Schweitzer. I want to put your name up there. I know you're very humble about it, but just really impressed at the great work you do and all the advocacy, and congratulations on the book, and thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Been a pleasure.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you
Thank
for
you for
listening.
reading so carefully. Oh my gosh.
How could I not? What a pleasure it's been to speak with Dr. Benjamin Gilmer today. You can now subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts and leave a 5-star review. You can also ask for it by name using Alexa and find it on Stitcher, Spotify, and if you want to give money to Jeff Bezos, let's not do that, but Amazon Music. Follow me on Instagram where I'm at Chills at Will Podcast, or on Twitter where I'm at Chills at Will PO1. This is a passion project of mine, a DIY operation, and I'd love for your help in promoting what I'm convinced is a unique and spirited look at an often ignored art form. The intro song for the Chills at Will podcast is Wind Down, instrumental, and the other song played on the episode was Hoops, instrumental by Matt Whitehour, and both songs are used through archesaudio.com. Please tune in for episode 108 with Navdeep Singh Dhillon, the author of Sunny G's series of Rash Decisions. He is an adjunct professor of creative writing and English at Borough of Manhattan Community College and co-founder of Ishq in a Backpack, a narrative travel blog. This episode will air on March 8th. For now, thanks again for listening, and I hope that these quarantine days bring you texts by writers with mad skills, like Dr. Benjamin Gilmer, whose work, like the other Dr. Gilmer, give you chills at will.